The great hall of the Zarethi Empire was brighter than a star. Long silver pillars touched the high ceiling. Blue fire burned in floating circles above the crowd. Thousands of alien nobles filled the seats. Their armor shined. Their eyes watched the center stage. Today was not a normal day. Today, Princess Alyra would choose her royal partner. For centuries, this ceremony had followed one rule. The princess would choose the strongest warrior from the noble houses. Strength meant power. Power meant control. And control meant survival in a dangerous galaxy. The king and queen sat on their high throne. The king's armor was black and heavy. The queen's crown glowed with cold light. Both watched their daughter carefully. Princess Alyra stood in the center of the hall. She wore white royal armor. A long silver cape fell behind her. And her face was calm, but her eyes were sharp. Before her stood 12 powerful alien princes. Each one had won battles. Each one had defeated enemies. Each one believed he would be chosen. At the far end of the hall, a small group of human representatives stood quietly. Earth had recently joined the Empire. Humans were new. They were not strong compared to most species. They were smaller, slower, physically weaker. Most nobles did not respect them. Among the humans stood one young man named Daniel Hayes. He was not a soldier. He was not a hero. He was only a cultural advisor sent from Earth. He wore a simple dark suit instead of armor. He did not belong here. A loud voice echoed through the hall. "Let the selection begin." One by one, the alien princes stepped forward. Each one showed his strength. Some lifted heavy crystal pillars, and some displayed advanced weapons. One even showed battle scars from fighting space pirates. The crowd cheered loudly. Princess Alyra watched them all. Her face did not change. Minutes passed. Then something strange happened. She did not call the final prince forward. Instead, she turned her head slowly. Her eyes moved past the warriors, past the generals, past the nobles. They stopped at the far end of the hall, at the human delegation. The hall slowly became quiet. Daniel felt something change in the air. He did not understand why. He looked behind him, thinking she was staring at someone else, but she was not. She was looking directly at him. The princess raised her hand, and she pointed. Gasps filled the hall. "No," one noble whispered. "That is a human," another said. The king leaned forward in his throne. The queen's eyes narrowed. Princess Alyra's voice was calm but clear. "I choose him." Silence. Complete silence. Daniel felt his heart pound in his chest. He looked around again, hoping this was a mistake. But the royal guards were already moving toward him. The nobles began to murmur loudly. "This is an insult. A human cannot rule beside her. This breaks tradition." The strongest alien prince stepped forward angrily. His armor was red. His voice shook the hall. "Princess, this is foolish. He is weak. He has no victories, no power." Princess Alyra did not look at the prince. She kept her eyes on Daniel. "Bring him forward," she ordered. 2 royal guards gently but firmly escorted Daniel across the hall. Every eye followed him. He felt small under their gaze. When he reached the center, he stood alone beside the princess. The size difference was clear. Many aliens were taller and stronger. The king finally spoke. "Daughter," he said slowly, "do you understand what you are doing?" "Yes, father." "You choose a human, a species that has only recently entered our empire." "Yes." "Explain." Princess Alyra turned to face the crowd. "I have watched the galaxy closely," she said. "Strength alone does not protect an empire anymore." The nobles looked confused. The red-armored prince laughed. "He cannot even lift a war blade." Daniel stayed silent. His hands were slightly shaking, but he kept his back straight. The princess stepped closer to him. "You see weakness," she said to the nobles. "I see something else." The queen spoke softly, but her voice carried power. "And what do you see?" The princess looked at Daniel for a long moment. "I see survival." More whispers spread through the hall. The king stood up slowly. The sound of his armor echoed. "Human," the king said, now addressing Daniel directly. "Did you know about this?" Daniel swallowed. "No, Your Majesty." "Do you understand the weight of this choice?" I do not fully understand, sir." The hall filled with quiet laughter, but the princess did not smile. She raised her voice. "He survived the fall of his world's systems. He survived global war. He survived political collapse. Humans fight even when hope is gone." The red-armored prince stepped forward again. Words, nothing more. The king raised his hand. Silence returned. "If you choose him," the king said to his daughter, "oh, he must prove his worth before this court." A long pause followed. The princess did not hesitate. "Then let him be tested." The crowd reacted instantly. Some were excited, some were angry, some were ready for humiliation. Daniel felt the weight of thousands of eyes again. He had come as a simple advisor. Now he stood at the center of the most powerful empire in the galaxy. And tomorrow, he would face a royal trial. The blue fire above flickered slightly, and somewhere in the crowd, someone watched him not with anger, but with deadly intent. The news of the princess's decision spread through the great hall like fire through dry grass. Nobles leaned toward each other, whispering in sharp tones. Some looked angry, some amused, and others deeply insulted. For them, this was not just a strange choice. It was a challenge to their traditions, their bloodlines, and their pride. The idea that a human, a species many still saw as new and unproven, could stand beside the future ruler of the empire felt impossible. Daniel stood quietly beside Princess Aelira, trying to control his breathing. He understood that every movement he made was being judged. The king remained standing, his expression unreadable, while the queen observed everything with cold patience. The red-armored prince, whose name was Lord Varex, stepped forward again. He bowed slightly to the king, but kept his eyes locked on Daniel. He spoke with confidence, but there was anger behind his voice. He said that if the princess insisted on choosing a human, then the human must face a proper royal trial. Not a simple test of words, but a test that would prove whether he had any value in the empire. The king listened carefully and then slowly nodded. He declared that the trial would begin at once. The crowd reacted with loud approval, eager to see the human fail. For them, this was entertainment and justice at the same time. The guards escorted Daniel to the center platform of the hall, where a circular field of light formed around him. The king explained that the first trial would not be about physical strength, because strength alone was too simple. Instead, the trial would test awareness, strategy, and survival instinct. A large holographic battlefield appeared around Daniel, showing a war scenario from the outer systems. Enemy fleets, damaged colonies, limited resources, and civilian ships trapped between two hostile forces were displayed in sharp detail. Thus the task was clear: command the defense and protect as many lives as possible with limited options. Many nobles smiled with confidence, certain that the human would fail quickly. Daniel stared at the battlefield projection, his mind racing. He had studied history and conflict on Earth, and he knew that sometimes survival depended on hard decisions. Instead of trying to defeat the enemy fleet directly, he redirected civilian ships through a dangerous but hidden asteroid path. He sacrificed military ships to create distractions while secretly cutting off the enemy supply line. The simulation moved quickly, showing the results of his decisions. In the end, the Empire technically lost territory, but most civilians survived, and the enemy retreated due to lack of resources. The hall became quiet. The outcome was not glorious, but it was effective. The king leaned forward with interest. Daniel had not chosen pride. He had chosen survival. Princess Alira watched him carefully, and there was a small look of satisfaction in her eyes. However, Lord Varix did not accept this result. He argued that strategy meant nothing without strength to defend it. He demanded a second trial, one that would test the human directly. The crowd supported him loudly, hungry for a more physical challenge. The king agreed once more. The first trial had shown intelligence. Now the human would face something far more dangerous. The royal guards removed the holographic battlefield and replaced it with a combat arena shield. Energy walls rose around the circular platform, glowing blue and forming a sealed dueling space. Lord Varix stepped inside first, it removing his heavy cloak and revealing layered battle armor beneath. He was taller than Daniel by nearly a head, his muscles thick and built from years of war. The nobles cheered loudly, confident that this would end quickly. Daniel was handed a standard energy blade, lighter and smaller than the weapons used by alien warriors. He held it carefully, aware that one mistake could end everything. Princess Alira did not speak, but her eyes never left Daniel. The king raised his hand, signaling the start of the duel. Lord Varix attacked immediately with powerful swings meant to overwhelm. Daniel barely avoided the first strike, feeling the heat of the blade pass close to his shoulder. The crowd roared with excitement. Varix continued pressing forward, using brute force and heavy strikes. Daniel moved quickly, staying out of direct range, and observing patterns in the alien's movements. He noticed that Varix relied on strength and speed, but left small openings after wide attacks. Instead of trying to match power, Daniel used the arena itself. He positioned himself near energy pillars that powered the shield. When Varix charged again, Daniel dodged at the last second, causing the larger warrior to crash into one of the pillars. The impact disrupted Varix's balance for only a moment, but that moment was enough. Daniel used the flat side of his blade to strike the power joint in Varix's armor, creating a short circuit. Sparks flew and the red-armored prince dropped to one knee as his armor systems failed. The hall fell silent again. Daniel stood a few steps away, breathing heavily but still standing. He did not press for a killing blow. Instead, he stepped back and lowered his weapon, signaling that the duel was finished. The king slowly stood from his throne once more, clearly impressed by the human's restraint. The nobles were no longer laughing. For the second time that day, the human had surprised them. But beneath the surface of shock and growing respect, something darker began to grow. Not everyone in the hall would accept this outcome peacefully, and the danger surrounding the human had only just begun. The silence that followed the duel felt heavier than any cheering crowd. Lord Varix was helped to his feet by the royal guards, his damaged armor sparking slightly as he stepped back from the arena. No one could deny what had happened. The human had not overpowered him, but he had outthought him. Among the nobles, expressions began to change. Some now watched Daniel with curiosity instead of mockery, but others looked at him with something far more dangerous: fear. Fear that traditions were shifting, fear that power was changing hands in ways they could not control. The king studied Daniel carefully, as if measuring him against unseen standards, while the queen remained silent, her gaze sharp and unreadable. Before the king could formally close the trial, a loud voice echoed from the upper levels of the hall. It was Lord Calith, an older noble with influence across several outer systems. He declared that intelligence and clever movement were not enough to stand beside the future ruler of the empire. He claimed that the princess was allowing emotion to weaken the throne. His words were careful, but carried weight, and several nobles voiced their agreement. The hall, and which had begun to settle, grew restless again. Princess Alira stepped forward calmly, her expression firm. She reminded them that the empire had survived not only through strength, but through adaptation. She spoke of ancient wars that nearly destroyed entire star systems because leaders refused to change. Daniel listened quietly, aware that the conflict was no longer about him alone. It was about the future direction of the empire. The king finally raised his hand for silence and declared that the trials had proven the human possessed both strategy and discipline. However, he also announced that acceptance by the throne required more than skill. It required loyalty and courage under real danger. Almost as if summoned by his words, the lights in the great hall flickered. A low vibration moved through the floor, subtle but unnatural. But the guards immediately tightened their formation around the royal family. Confusion spread through the nobles as security systems began flashing red warnings along the walls. Suddenly, a section of the upper balcony exploded outward in a burst of energy. Smoke and debris fell into the hall as masked attackers in dark armor dropped from the broken structure. Their movements were precise and coordinated, not random chaos. They were not foreign enemies from outside the empire. Their armor carried hidden noble symbols, meaning this attack came from within. Panic rippled through the crowd as nobles scrambled for safety. The attackers aimed directly toward the royal platform, ignoring everyone else. It was a direct assassination attempt. The royal guards engaged immediately, energy weapons lighting the hall with sharp flashes of blue and red. In the middle of the chaos, Princess Elira was briefly separated from the main guard unit as one attacker broke through the defensive line. Daniel reacted without thinking. He grabbed a fallen guard's shield device and positioned himself between the attacker and the princess. The attacker swung a charged blade downward, but Daniel raised the shield just in time. The impact sent a shock through his arm, nearly knocking him down, yet he held his ground. Instead of retreating, he moved forward, using the shield to push the attacker off balance. A nearby guard finished the threat seconds later, but the moment had already been seen by everyone watching. The attack ended as quickly as it began, with several attackers captured and others neutralized. Smoke still drifted through the hall as order slowly returned. The nobles were shaken. But this was not a simple political argument anymore. Someone had tried to remove the princess during the very ceremony meant to secure her future. The king's expression hardened as he looked across the damaged balcony. His voice carried deep anger when he declared that betrayal would be punished without mercy. But his gaze soon shifted to Daniel, who still stood near the princess, breathing heavily, yet refusing to step back. For the first time since the ceremony began, the king did not see a human outsider. He saw someone who had chosen to protect the throne without hesitation. Princess Elira looked at Daniel not with surprise, but with quiet confirmation. It was as if she had expected this moment. The nobles who had doubted him now faced a difficult truth. Strength had failed to protect the princess. Pride had failed to predict the attack. Yet the human, the one they called weak, had stepped forward without command or fear. The balance inside the empire was shifting, and everyone in the hall could feel it. After the hall was secured and the wounded were taken away, the king ordered all doors sealed. No one would leave until the situation was understood. The captured attackers were identified as supporters of Lord Caliph, though the noble himself denied direct involvement. Tension filled the chamber like thick smoke. The king addressed the assembly with controlled fury, explaining that internal division was more dangerous than any external enemy. He reminded them that the galaxy was entering a period of instability, with rival empires testing borders and unknown threats appearing in distant systems. Princess Elira then stepped forward to speak openly at last. She explained that her choice had never been about romance or impulse. For years, she had studied reports from across the galaxy, including detailed records of human history. She spoke of Earth's near destruction through global wars, climate collapse, and internal conflict. She described how humans had survived, not because they were the strongest species, but because they adapted quickly, rebuilt rapidly, and continued moving forward even when systems failed. She told the nobles that the empire's current structure relied too heavily on tradition and predictable strength. Enemies could study and counter strength, but adaptation was harder to defeat. Daniel stood quietly as she described humanity's flaws as well as its resilience. She did not call humans perfect. She called them persistent. She said that the future ruler of the empire must stand beside someone who understood survival beyond pride. The assassination attempt only proved her point. While nobles argued over status, unseen threats had already formed inside their own ranks. The empire needed leaders who could think beyond tradition and act without waiting for permission. Daniel had done exactly that when he stepped between her and danger. The king listened carefully to every word. When she finished, he descended from his throne and walked slowly across the hall toward Daniel. The entire assembly watched in silence. Standing face to face with the human, the king asked him a simple question. If given power beside the throne, would he protect the empire even when it meant making unpopular decisions? Daniel answered honestly that he would protect it the same way humans protected their own world, by choosing survival first and pride second. He did not promise perfection, he promised effort and loyalty. The king turned to face the nobles and announced that the trials were complete. The human had proven intelligence, restraint, courage, and loyalty under real threat. Whether they accepted it or not, the princess's choice would stand. Some nobles bowed reluctantly, others remained stiff with disagreement, but none dared challenge the throne openly again that day. The ceremony that began with mockery had ended with blood and revelation. The empire had witnessed not just a selection, but the beginning of change. Yet even as the hall settled and formal acceptance was declared, distant political forces were already reacting. News of a human standing beside the future ruler would not stay contained within those walls. Allies would question it. Enemies would test it. And somewhere in the shadows of the galaxy, those who feared change would begin planning their next move. The ceremony officially ended, but the feeling inside the Great Hall did not return to normal. The attack had exposed cracks within the empire, and the announcement of the princess's decision had created new ones. Over the next few days, messages spread across star systems faster than trade ships. Some outer colonies reacted with curiosity, others with anger. Several powerful houses sent formal protests, claiming the throne was weakening tradition. The king ignored the protests publicly, but behind closed doors he held long strategy meetings with his advisors. The empire was stable on the surface, yet tension moved beneath it like pressure building before a storm. Daniel remained inside the royal complex under heavy protection. He understood that his life was now more valuable and more fragile than ever. He was no longer just a human representative. He was a symbol. Princess Elira spent time briefing him on galactic politics, trade alliances, and military structure. She did not treat him as decoration or reward. She treated him as a partner who needed to understand the weight of the crown. Daniel listened carefully, learning quickly. He began noticing patterns in how noble houses aligned themselves, how resources moved between systems, and how military fleets positioned themselves near unstable borders. It was during one of these briefings that urgent news arrived from the Outer Rim territories. A border station had gone silent. Patrol ships sent to investigate found debris fields and disabled satellites. Long-range scans detected an unidentified fleet moving through asteroid cover. The ships were not broadcasting known signatures. They were not part of any recognized empire. The king immediately called a war council. High-ranking generals filled the chamber, projecting star maps into the air. Tension grew as data confirmed that the unknown fleet was advancing toward a lightly defended colony rich in energy resources. Several generals demanded immediate deployment of heavy warships to crush the threat with overwhelming force. They argued that strength must be shown quickly to discourage further aggression. Daniel listened quietly before asking for permission to speak. The room fell silent, some officers clearly irritated that a human would interrupt military planning. With the king's nod, Daniel suggested that the fleet's movement pattern looked cautious rather than aggressive. He pointed out that they were avoiding direct communication, but also avoiding civilian transport routes. He proposed sending a smaller reconnaissance squadron first to gather more information instead of launching a full assault that might escalate an unknown situation. The generals argued back, calling it hesitation. But Princess Elira supported the suggestion, noting that unnecessary escalation could trap the Empire in a larger conflict. And the king considered both sides carefully before approving a balanced plan, a reconnaissance force backed by hidden support ships at a distance. The decision carried risk, but it avoided immediate large-scale war. Within hours, ships launched from the capital, their engines burning bright against the darkness of space. Days later, the reconnaissance squadron transmitted critical information. The unidentified fleet belonged to a displaced species fleeing destruction from a distant region. Their home system had been consumed by a rare stellar collapse event, and they were searching desperately for new territory. They had attacked the border station only to secure resources and disable communications out of fear of being rejected. They were not an organized invasion force, but survivors acting without trust. The War Council chamber fell silent as this information was reviewed. Had the Empire launched a full assault immediately, it would have destroyed a desperate refugee fleet and ignited a conflict based on misunderstanding. Daniel's suggestion had prevented unnecessary bloodshed. The king ordered diplomatic channels opened under heavy security, and negotiations began. The displaced species agreed to settle in an unoccupied outer system under Imperial supervision rather than fight. A potential war turned into a strategic alliance opportunity. News of this outcome spread quickly. Nobles who doubted Daniel began to reconsider their stance. His approach did not show weakness. It showed calculation. The Empire gained new allies instead of enemies, new workers instead of ruins. But Princess Elira publicly credited the decision to collaborative thinking within the council, but everyone knew who had first questioned the rush to war. The humans' influence was becoming visible beyond the palace walls. However, not all threats came from outside. Lord Caliph and his supporters continued to maneuver quietly within political circles. They spread rumors that the throne was allowing outsiders to reshape imperial policy. They argued that mercy would invite exploitation. Tension between reform and tradition continued to grow. The Empire had avoided one crisis, but another was forming beneath the surface, built not on weapons but on ideology. Daniel began to understand that winning duels and surviving attacks were only the beginning. The real battle was for direction. If the Empire changed too quickly, it could fracture. If it refused to change, it could stagnate and fall. The balance required patience and strength together. Princess Elira often discussed these concerns with him late into the night, analyzing reports and predicting reactions. Their partnership was no longer questioned openly, but it was still being tested quietly. Far beyond the capital, in a hidden sector near unstable stars, a different force watched the Empire's movements. Unlike the displaced refugees, this force was organized and deliberate. They observed how the Empire handled crisis and noted the growing influence of the human beside the princess. They saw opportunity in division and weakness in reform. Silent ships moved through dark space, recording signals and calculating future actions. The calm after the border incident was temporary. Inside the palace, Daniel stood on a balcony overlooking the city lights of the capital world. He had come from a small planet called Earth, once divided and fragile. Now he stood at the center of a galactic empire that faced decisions far larger than anything humanity had known. He understood that survival did not come from strength alone, nor from kindness alone, but from the ability to adjust when conditions changed. The Empire had taken its first steps toward that adjustment. Yet the stars beyond the capital shimmered with uncertainty. The refugee fleet had been only a warning of how unstable the galaxy had become. Stronger threats would follow, political resistance would grow, enemies would test boundaries. And in every coming crisis, the choice made in that royal hall would be judged again and again. And the alien princess had chosen a human in front of her royal court, and that single moment had begun a chain of events that would shape the fate of the empire for generations. The months that followed were not peaceful, even though the empire avoided open conflict with the refugee fleet. Political pressure continued to grow. Lord Caliph and several powerful houses began forming a quiet alliance, claiming they only wanted to protect tradition. In truth, they feared losing control. Trade routes started facing unusual delays. Military patrols received conflicting orders from regional commanders loyal to old, noble families. Nothing was openly rebellious, but the signs were clear. The empire was slowly dividing between those who supported adaptation and those who wanted absolute strength to remain the only rule. Then the true storm arrived. Long-range scanners detected a massive fleet entering Imperial territory from an uncharted region. Unlike the refugees, this force moved in tight formation, heavily armed and disciplined. They did not send warnings. They did not negotiate. Within days, 2 outer defense stations were destroyed without survivors. The fleet carried advanced weapons capable of disabling shield networks quickly. Reports showed that the attackers studied Imperial formations before striking weak points. This was not chaos. This was calculated invasion. The War Council assembled immediately. Panic was visible even among experienced generals. The enemy ships were stronger than expected and moved unpredictably. Traditional defense patterns were failing. Several nobles demanded immediate total war, calling for every major house to deploy its fleets in a show of overwhelming strength. However, intelligence reports showed that the enemy was dividing Imperial forces by attacking multiple distant systems at once. If the Empire gathered all fleets in one location, other colonies would fall. Daniel studied the battle maps carefully. He noticed that the invaders were avoiding heavily populated systems and instead targeting communication hubs and supply chains. Their goal was not simple conquest. It was to weaken the Empire's ability to coordinate. He suggested decentralizing command temporarily and giving outer colonies controlled independence in defensive decisions. Many generals resisted this idea, arguing it would weaken central authority. But Daniel explained that centralized control was exactly what the enemy was trying to break. If communication hubs fell, the entire defense structure would collapse. However, if each region could operate independently using flexible strategies, the enemy would lose their advantage. Princess Aelira supported the proposal, and after intense debate, the king approved it. Orders were sent across the empire. Regional commanders were granted temporary strategic autonomy under strict loyalty agreements. It was a risky move. Some nobles feared it would create permanent fragmentation. But within days, the results began to show. Instead of facing predictable fleets, the invaders encountered varied tactics. Some systems used asteroid ambushes. Others employed hit-and-run tactics combined with electronic warfare. Smaller, faster human-designed strike ships were introduced into formations, using unconventional movement patterns that confused enemy targeting systems. The war was still brutal. Several colonies suffered heavy damage. Lives were lost. But the Empire no longer fought as a single rigid force. It fought as a network of adaptive defenders. The invaders began losing ships faster than expected. Their commanders, used to predictable enemy responses, struggled to adjust. Daniel worked day and night alongside military analysts, predicting enemy movements based on supply routes and fuel usage. His understanding of human war history, especially asymmetric conflict, proved valuable. He knew that powerful forces often underestimated flexible opponents. During one critical battle near the Orcs belt, the enemy launched a massive assault on a key resource world. Imperial fleets were too far away to respond in time. And Daniel proposed using civilian mining vessels retrofitted with basic weapons to create a temporary blockade while warships traveled at maximum speed. Many officers hesitated, fearing civilian losses. Daniel argued that without action, the world would fall completely. Volunteers stepped forward, inspired by the defense of their home. The blockade held long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Though losses were heavy, the planet survived. The turning point came when Imperial forces captured one of the enemy command ships. Interrogation and data extraction revealed that the invaders were a coalition of war-driven species who believed the Empire had grown weak and divided. They expected political chaos after news spread that a human influenced the throne. Instead, they found unexpected unity in adaptation. The very choice they mocked became the Empire's strength. The king addressed the entire Empire through a galaxy-wide broadcast. Standing beside Princess Elira and Daniel, he declared that the war proved something greater than tradition. He said strength without flexibility fails against intelligent threats. He publicly acknowledged that the princess's decision to choose a human was not a break from tradition, but an evolution of it. The Empire's survival depended on leaders who could think beyond pride. As battles continued across the stars, the invaders slowly retreated, their losses too high to sustain expansion. The Empire did not chase them recklessly. Instead, it fortified key systems and strengthened alliances, including the refugee species who now fought alongside Imperial fleets. What began as doubt had transformed into cooperation. When the war finally ended months later, the Empire stood damaged but alive. Cities would need rebuilding, fleets would need repair, but the structure remained intact. In the Great Hall, where the ceremony once shocked the nobles, a new gathering took place. This time, there was no laughter when Daniel entered. There was no whisper of weakness. The nobles bowed, some sincerely, others respectfully, out of recognition of reality. Princess Elira stood before the assembly and spoke clearly. She reminded them that the future would bring new threats, new changes, and new challenges. But she said that fear of change was more dangerous than change itself. The Empire had survived because it learned to adapt, and adaptation required courage. Daniel looked around the hall, remembering the moment when he first stood there, unsure and surrounded by doubt. He had not asked to be chosen. He had not expected to shape a galaxy. Yet through trial, attack, and war, he had proven something simple but powerful. Humanity's greatest strength was not size or weapons. It was the refusal to stop learning. The alien princess had chosen him in front of her royal court. At that moment, many believed it was a mistake. Now it was clear that it had been the decision that saved an empire.